Hi guys, welcome to Simple Programming. In our previous video, we looked at the round 1 interview questions, and in this video, let's take a look at the round 2 interview questions. Okay, so the round 2 started with a series of interview questions on functional interface of Java 8. The interviewer asked me various questions on functional interfaces for quite some time. So I'll give you a few tips on how to really, impress an interviewer when you are asked these questions. Okay, so first question was like, obviously, he asked me what is a functional interface. I told him like, hey, a functional interface is an interface with a single abstract method, and its implementation may be treated as Lambda expressions. So then next question was like, what are the different function interfaces that you have worked on? Like, so the way to answer this question, right, you can say like that you have worked on predicate, consumer, supplier, and function. But when you talk about these function interface, right, try to give a real-time example. For example, predicate is obviously used in the filter, right? When you do a dot filter, especially when you work on the streams, right? Filter is actually a predicate, and consumer is actually used inside the for each. Supplier is something that when you want to give an output without an input. So basically, it's like you can use it in places where you have no input but expected to give an output. Okay, so then you can make a use of a supplier. And that's function, right? Function, you can say like functions are like pretty much very vastly used inside enum classes. Like if you want to build a enum map, right, then very commonly used inside this enum classes, especially the functionality called identity of function. So when you do function dot identity, right, it's going to give the type of the the object that on which the function acts upon. So these are like examples that you can give to the interviewer. So this really tells the interviewer that you have in-depth knowledge on functional interfaces. This is how you should answer. Give example for each and every questions that they ask you. Just not give plain definition about a concept. Okay. So let's move on. So the next question was like, can a functional interface have default and static method? Yes, of course. A functional interface. What is a functional interface? Functional interface is something that has one abstract method. Okay, so the question was like, can a functional interface have default and static methods? Yes, of course. A functional interface can have default and static methods. A very good example for this is the predicate functional interface. The predicate functional interface has a default and static implementations for or and is equal methods. So you can just tell them like these are the examples of that. So then the next question is like, why function interface has only one method? So this is a very good question. Like, so the thing is like, let's say you have an interface that has two methods. Okay, let's just assume an interface that has two methods of same time. If you're going to use that interface inside a Lambda, right, Lambda will not be able to recognize the method that it should use or invoke because Lambda does not have a name. Remember, Lambda does not have a name, so it makes it difficult for the Lambda to recognize the method that it has to actually invoke, in the expression that you've used. So this is why this is why the Java developers, right, they thought like, okay, if you're going to define a interface as a functional interface, just make sure that it has only one method in it. Okay, then the next question was like the scope of Lambda. Okay, so it was asking about what is the scope of Lambda and what can I really do inside a Lambda function. Okay, so the scope of Lambdas, right, so you can actually give you some examples. Like for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. Okay, so let's say the local variables in a method can be used inside a Lambda. Okay, but it has to be effectively final. What do you mean by effectively final? So for that, right, let's take a look at the anonymous classes that we had like pre-Java 8. Okay, before Java 8. So in Java, before Java 8, right, when you're using anonymous classes, in order to use a local variable, it has to be final explicitly declared. Okay, the variable has to be explicitly declared as final variable. But in Java 8 inside Lambda, right, you don't have to declare it explicitly as final, but the variable should be effectively final. So let me give you an example. Let me quickly open up my Eclipse, and I'll show you an example of what it means as effectively final. Okay, let me quickly open up some random Java file. Okay, let's just take this example. I'm just going to show you an error, so we're not going to run anything. So let's just use the main Spring Boot application Java file itself. Okay, let's say I have a int count equal to 0. Okay, and let's say I have something called list string is equal to new array list. So let's say I want to do for each. Okay, So let's say I want to do something inside the for each, and let's say if I want to do okay, I want to print something. Okay, so in this case, right, you can just do dot each, and it's definitely going to print whatever is present inside this list. So now let's say I want to do a plus uh, count. Okay, so now it's going to print the count here, but let's say if I do plus plus, it's throwing an error. So let's take a look at the error. Local variable count defined in an enclosing scope must be final or effectively final. So this is what is meant by effectively final of the variables that is used inside a Java, inside a Lambda. Okay, the same goes for list also. So okay, so I'll show you another example. Let's keep this Lambda. Okay, we are not going to do anything on the S, but I'm going to define another list. Okay, let's say I have a list B, and what I'm going to do is, like, I'm going to do B dot B is equal to arrays as list. So I'm just going to put a few elements inside this B list. So but you could see here there is an error. So what does that mean? So it says local variable B defined in an enclosing scope must be final or effective final. So this is what is meant by the scope of the Lambda expression. You can actually make use of a variable inside a method, but it has to be effectively final. You cannot alter it. You can pass in a list and add elements inside the list, but you cannot reassign this list to another list because it has to be effectively final. You can do this, like for example, let's say I want to do add. If I do T, right, it's not going to throw an error, but you can't reassign this. So this is what is meant by effectively final, and this explains the scope of Lambda expression. So this is a very good question, and I hope it really cleared a lot of things for you. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so the next question was like, explain the Kafka implementation in Spring Boot project. So basically, it's like asking, how will you implement Kafka in a Spring Boot project? So you can actually explain the ways of the different ways of implementing Kafka in Spring Boot project. There are two ways. One is the auto configuration method, and another is manual configuration. So you'll have to define your producer config and your consumer config and all the stuffs inside, and then make use of the Kafka template and all those things. So you can actually explain these things. So let's move on. So the next question was like, can I use Kafka without a zookeeper? No, you cannot use Kafka without a zookeeper. So the reason is it is impossible to bypass zookeeper and connect directly to the Kafka server. So the answer is definitely no. If somehow the zookeeper is down, right, then it is impossible to service any client request. So zookeeper is the one that actually holds the entire ecosystem of Kafka architecture. So without zookeeper, you cannot use Kafka. So then let's move on. What about the asset properties and microservices like transaction scaling, multiple microservices? So basically, when you work on a microservice architecture, right, it's very difficult to achieve a very strong asset properties because a transaction might not span in one microservice, and especially if that microservice, every microservice has individual databases, then it's definitely not going to, it's not going to be a consistent asset property. So there are different patterns that you can use to do all these things. So let me give you an example. Okay, so let's say a request comes to microservice A. Microservice A processes request, saves that request into the database and sends to microservice B. Microservice B actually processes it and sends back to A and then to the user. Microservice A and B has two different data sources, so obviously they'll have two different records. The functionality that for which the microservice A has been defined will process the request according to its need, and then it stores the results according to the functionality of microservice A. Microservice B is going to process something about regarding its functionality, and it's going to share the store the data, record in the database. So this is why you cannot have a very strong asset properties when you work in microservice architecture. But then again you can define a materialized view of these different data sources and actually use CQRS on top of it to have at least a consistent record of what's happening in your architecture. Okay, so let's move on. So the question was like, what is the difference between put and patch? Put is where you use to update an entire object into a database, whereas patch is, let's say you want to, let's say take an example. You have a student object, right? Object has departments, subject, and all those things. So let's say I just want to update the subject object inside the student object, right? You just have to do patch and pass in the subject way elements inside the patch, and then it is going to update the database. So that's an example of put and patch. Okay, so the next question was like, how will you implement put? And then he further asked me like, I was explaining about the put, how I would implement a put in a Spring Boot application or a REST project, and then he was asking me like, what if the transaction ID or some kind of ID that you send doesn't match with the database? Then I said like, obviously I'm going to throw an error to the end user. So he mentioned that like the REST doc says that you can also save data when the data is not found. But the thing is like, this depends upon depending upon the functionality that you're going to work on. It's not going to be true for all the scenarios. Okay, this is kind of like a tricky question. So the question might be being asked in a way to understand how well I understand the business functionalities and other things. So I told him like, this cannot be a case for every other scenario. Okay, this can be a case for one scenario, and there might be 99 different scenarios where you have to do a different thing inside inside your controller or service IMPL. So to answer to this question, I told him like, hey, you're gonna do this for all the scenarios. So there are different scenarios where it might not work. So I gave him a scenario from my project. Okay, so let's say you make a payment in credit card, right? Your first transaction gets saved, and there's an update on this particular credit card transaction. So obviously your system is going to ingest a request as put, and you have a transaction ID. And there's another third-party system, like let's say you have a Visa, Mastercard, and all those others providers, right? So though you have to pass in the request to those guys. So let me give you an example where the transaction itself has not happened in the first place, and you don't have a record. And about whatever you're saying, right? If the data is not found, you have to insert the data. And if someone is incorrectly doing a put request on some transaction ID that is not even present in my database, according to your logic, then I'll have to add an record inside my database for transaction that didn't happen through my system, and then I'll have to pass it to a different third party, and imagine what kind of confusion it might create. So this is how you have to give examples of sometimes the questions might not be the straightforward questions, but it really helps when you give scenario based answers. So next question was, we discussed briefly about delete mapping. So he was asking me how will you implement delete mapping, and then he was asking like, delete is not a frequent implementation for products. So I explained, he asked me like, why do you think it's so? So I told him like, usually we don't give delete mapping to be done through REST applications, because obviously production data, you don't give control to delete anything until unless something is created by the consumer, and then the consumer wants to delete it. For example, let's say he creates a loan application, right? He wants to delete that loan application, then you can give a delete. You can't give delete for each and everything. So that's why I said like, delete is like very, very, very rare case scenarios you will implement delete. So we moved on, and the 12th question was like, let's say two beans are there in my config. I want bean B to be initialized before bean A. How will you do it? So there is a annotation at depends on. You can use this annotation to invoke a bean before a different bean. So that was a pretty straightforward question, but it's good to know. Okay, if you have not heard about at depends on, please take a look at that. Just Google about it. Okay. So let's move on. Two configurations are there, like there's configuration A and configuration B in my Spring Boot. Okay, how to use configuration B beans inside configuration A. So obviously Spring gives you different options to do it. There are two annotations you can use, again at import and at import resource. So you can use this to import the beans from configuration B inside configuration A. So pretty straightforward. Okay, so the next question was about pessimistic locking and optimistic locking. Okay, let me give you an example about optimistic locking. Let's say there are two users, A and B. Okay, let's say the user A is doing some changes in his web application, and let's say for some reason he didn't click on the update button. It just didn't go to the database or anything. So user B comes in and he makes changes to something. Let's assume these two users are admins. Okay, So user B comes in and he makes changes to the same page and he does something regarding that, and he clicks on update and actually it gets updated. So let's say user B comes back, user A comes back after some time, and let's say he resumes updating this. So what will happen now is like the application should handle the latest updates before allowing user A actions to be changed, to be updated in the database. So this is called optimistic locking, and it just takes the optimistic view of data conflicts. Okay, so the next is pessimistic. Pessimistic is like the word suggests, right? It's not going to allow anyone to update. It's just going to lock the record for your exclusive use until you have finished it. So these are two different things. Then the next question was on this is like he was asking me like which kind of locking mechanism did you choose. This is like there is no clear right answer to this. It really depends upon your application functionality. Okay, so you cannot always say I can always go for optimistic locking, I can always go for pessimistic locking. It really depends upon your business requirements. Okay, let's move on. The next question was about Spring Transaction Management. The same question was asked in the round one also. So I gave the same answers. And then the next question was like, he was asking me like, what happens under at the rate of transaction? When you use at the rate of transaction on a method, right, what actually happens underneath? So basically, at the rate of transaction is an implementation of aspect-oriented programming. Okay, so it makes use of the before, after, and around method calls. So that's how you're able to achieve the transaction properties on a method level. So I don't know much about this. I just told him like this is how it might have used. So if you are really interested in the right, please take a look at Google something about this in the internet, and you should be able to get something. Okay, let's move on to the next question. I have some code inside a static block and some code inside at the rate of post construct block, which will run first. Okay, so I'll tell you exactly the scenario that the interviewer asked me. So let's say you have a class. Okay, you have auto-write some kind of another class like a service or repository. Let's say you have a list of student in it. Okay, you have defined a private static list of student, okay, as a new array list. Inside the static block, what you're going to do is like you're going to call you're going to do list dot add, and you're going to set new employees, some new employee or new student object inside that list of student. And then what you're going to do is like you're going to do the repository dot save all, or you're going to do the auto-wide class dot some method, whatever it is. You're going to make that call inside the static block. Okay, then you have a post construct block, and you're going to do the same inside that. So the question now is like which block will execute first. So obviously the static block will execute, and it might result in an error. Okay, because static block is like the initial first execution of your class. Okay, so it's like at the class level. The word static itself is like at the class level. So it might be, it is the first one to get executed, and by the time, if you don't have this auto white bean in your Spring container, right, then it's going to throw an error. So that's a difference. So then the next question was like explain about OAuth 2 process. So pretty straightforward question. I explained them about how OAuth 2 works. And then it was asking me about the different API gateways that I have used. I have not used much, many API gateways because my experience on Microservices is just 2.5 years. Okay, so I told him like I have worked on Apigee platform, and then I told him like there is obviously AWS API gateways there, and there is one provided by the Nginx. Yeah, so you can just tell them about this. Just tell them like whatever you're done. If you don't know the answer, right, just tell them like I don't know that. Okay, so the next question was about what are the different architecture design patterns to use with container technologies. Okay, so I haven't worked on many different architecture patterns. I just told them about the sidecar design pattern. So if you are really interested, right, take a look at on the internet, and you should be able to see a lot of design patterns available. Okay, so let's move on. So the question number 21 is like a request goes through a series of checks. Okay, basically multiple if loops, like more than 5 or 4 or 5 if loops, right? And these have some concrete implementations, like let's say each if else loop has like 10 lines or 15 lines of code. So what design pattern would suit this scenario? So obviously the obvious design pattern is chain of responsibility. That's a core idea of avoiding multiple if loops, and especially if loops has concrete implementations, that you would go for chain of responsibilities. It's basically like a chain. It acts like a chain. So that's what we need here, right? If else. So then, which future in cloud do you think is best according to you? These are like just normal questions, so you can there are no right or wrong answers. It's just they are just checking whether you understand cloud or understand the basic technologies that you put in your resume. I told them like according to me, auto scaling and high availability or like a good couple of cool features of cloud technologies, and those are like the most important factors for cloud to become so popular nowadays. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So how will you decide if you're ready for adapting microservice architecture? This is a very, very good question. So a lot of developers actually get confused and give a wrong answer. So I'm not sure if I gave the right answer, but I'll tell you what I actually told the interviewer. Okay, so there are different factors for you to consider before moving on to microservice architecture. Not microservice is not for everyone. It's okay. So you'll have to consider a lot of things before you actually decide that you're going to do a microservice. Okay, so I told him like let's say are you ready to adapt multiple frameworks and technologies for your organization. So then you have to think about let's say you want to define your entire business functionality as individual components, and failure to single process does not affect the entire system. Okay, and even microservice adapting to microservice actually need changes at your organization level. Like you have to adapt for smaller teams. Okay, when you work on monolithic or SOA projects, right, you'll have a very big team. But when you work with more microservice projects, you're going to do different. You're going to have some smaller project teams. Okay, so each team is going to take care of the individual microservice. One microservice is assigned to one team. Okay, two teams cannot work on a microservice, so one team has to work on one microservice. So then it's going to be the team size is going to be obviously 5 or 6. Okay, so that's how it is. So that's one thing. And then are you ready to deploy individual components independently, and are you ready to invest more on the DevOps side? So these are the questions that you'll have to think about. And the last good thing is like whether you would interested in doing horizontal scaling or vertical scaling. So what does horizontal scaling means is like, so horizontal scaling is nothing but adding multiple instances to your individual component, and for better performance. Okay, so whereas vertical scaling is like adding more power. That is you'll increase the size of your CPU and size of RAM. There's a limit on this vertical scaling because you can actually do it only for a very huge number. You can just do, there is a threshold on this, but you can keep on adding multiple instances. So that really depends upon the about your business requirements. So these are the different things that you can think. Actually, these are the different things that I can actually think of, but there are a lot of factors that you have to consider before going on to into a microservice ecosystem. What is the difference between monolithic SOA and microservice? Okay, this is pretty common nowadays. A lot of interviews ask you this questions about I would suggest you to take a look at very good definitions of these three and be prepared for this question. Okay, so monolithic is nothing but a very big project wherein all the software components of the application are assembled together and packaged, okay, as a single war. I'll give you an example. Like 10 years back, right, we had this web application where you would have worked on a spring based web application. You would have had JSP, your Java, everything coupled together into a single war, right? So that's one big monolithic. Then came SOA architecture, where you would have separated out the UI and the service components. So obviously, SOA is nothing but a collection of services which communicate with each other. Whereas microservice is an architectural style that actually structures the application as a collection of small autonomous services. If you look at SOA, right, you would again, it's kind of like a monolithic where entire Java services are placed inside one var. Whereas in case of microservices, right, you're going to split that particular SOA into multiple, individual autonomous components. So that's a different definition of microservice. The next question is, how will you decompose a monolithic project? There are multiple ways to decompose a monolithic project. You can decompose it through a business capability, like there is a domain-driven design pattern. I'm sure that most of you would have heard of it. You can use this domain-driven design patterns to decompose a microservice, and then you can actually decompose through subdomain concepts. And actually there are different ways to decompose. Like for example, let's say this is kind of like a common thing. Like let's say you have a very huge SOA project, right? Let's say your development has stopped and you're looking at microservice. So what nowadays teams are doing is like they're taking a small function, like small domain in that my SOA, and they're creating a microservice. Once it is ready, right, they're just mapping the services to the production API gateway of production. So at the one point of time, your SOA architecture is SOA domain is also available in the production as well as your microservice. So once this one domain is done, they'll take the next domain. So obviously they'll split up and take multiple domains like this until everything is covered inside a microservice architecture ecosystem, and then they will decommission the SOA architecture. So this is there are different ways to decompose monolithic, but it is quite hard. So how will you implement communication between microservices? Again, the same question was asked in the round one. I've answered about this. So logging mechanism for microservice, different ways you can do logging in your microservice architecture. Okay, so you can actually do logging from individual services to a log destination, and you can use Splunk and Elk Stack to to consolidate all these logs. Or what else you can do is like you can actually use a log aggregator. Log aggregator is like individual microservices will write logs to this log aggregator, and this log aggregator, which is like your own defined logging framework, is going to send the logs to the logging destination, either it's Elk Stack or Splunk. So he was asking me about why we chose Elk Stack instead of Splunk for login. I actually made a video about Elk Stack in my Spring Boot and Spring Cloud applications playlist. Please take a look at that. I've explained in detail about when you can go for Elk Stack and when Splunk you can go for Splunk. Okay. So the next question was like about the deployment of microservices. Okay, so I was asking him about what are the different ways you can deploy microservices. So if you haven't really worked on DevOps related things in your project, or if you're a pure developer, you can just tell like you might not know that, or you can tell that I don't know that. It's definitely not wrong to say that you don't know. Okay, so just don't give wrong answers. Okay, there are different ways you can deploy applications, right? So one is like you can deploy everything at once. Obviously there's going to be downtime if you're going to do everything at once. Then you can do rolling deployment, which is like you can roll out a single batch of services, and after any successful batch, right, you can keep on releasing the application. So then the most common thing that is used in large enterprises is like they call it as blue-green deployment. So the thing is like there is zero downtime for this blue-green deployment. Which is just like you create a stage environment and you deploy the V2 V3 version of your application. The new environment will be available for a week or two and can be validated independently and rolled back in case of any issues or any showstoppers. Okay, so then if everything goes well, right, you just swap the the production URL with the staging environment. So you'll have zero runtime, and this is like a much validated environment. And adding to this, right, you can do a canary release. Canary release is like you release the functionality to a subset of few users. Okay, so let's say you have few set of users which you can go and test out this application for the first 1 or 2 weeks. And then you can actually roll out the entire release. So this is called canary release. This is quite common and it's quite becoming popular nowadays among large enterprises. So you can do that also. So then there was let's move on. The importance of Spring Boot profile give us few scenarios where used. So this is like again the same question was asked in round one. The basic scenario is like you have configuration for QA, dev, and prod. You have DB configuration for QA, DB configuration for dev, and DB configuration for prod. Like you don't have to do a lot of manual configurations to have this activated. Depending upon the environment, those set of properties will be automatically picked up by Spring Boot. So that's the importance of Spring Boot profiles. Okay. So then the next question was about the caching mechanism. So when you work in microservice, distributed caching becomes a common function for thing that you have to consider. So I was talking about the different caching mechanisms that we have, different caching frameworks like Hazelcache, Gemfire, cache. Yeah. So these are different caching. There are a lot of caching frameworks like Redis is also a caching framework, and you can use that to as caching. So the additional point that I gave them is like how you can implement cache on an API gateway. If you implement a cache on an API gateway, right, you're not going to make that extra call to your microservice. Your call is not even going to go to the microservice. It's just going to stop on the API gateway and return back to the user. That way, it's going to be extra faster when you implement such way. So the one example I gave him about this. And then let's move on. Do you think we can use a database for caching? Okay, so he was asking me like, can we use database for caching? I told him like, hey, you don't have to use database for caching because there are a lot of frameworks that gives you the caching, that gives you very good features for caching. So I told him like, you don't have to use a database. If you use a database, right, then obviously there's going to be an IO operation call happening between your application and a database. So that's something that you don't want when you implement a cache. So then we went on to ask me like how deletion works in Cassandra. So I explained him about how deletion works in Cassandra. So what exactly happens in Cassandra, right? When you try to delete a record, right? When a delete is written to Cassandra, a tombstone is created, okay, and data is actually marked for deletion. It is not actually deleted. Delete does not happen immediately. The reason is, let's say there are few nodes are down, and those nodes need to learn about the mark for deletion once they are up, so they can replicate the data in their nodes equally. If deletion happens immediately, right, then if a node goes down, it might come up and replace the deleted data in the other node, thinking data is inconsistent or outdated. Okay, so it's called read repair. So since every node communicates with other nodes in a very consistent way, right, and they try to they try to maintain consistent data across the nodes. This might create a problem if you don't have if you immediately delete data in Cassandra database. So that's why you have a tombstone in Cassandra to mark a record for deletion, okay, instead of immediately deleting a record. Thanks, guys, and please subscribe for more such videos.